Blair Marigold discovered the invitation in the least glamorous corner of her life. Wedged beneath an overdue gas bill on the scarred workbench of her one-room repair studio, Gearling and Garnet, where loose watch springs and half-dismantled hard drives shared space with mugs of solder-clouded tea. The digital parchment shimmered on her cracked tablet, announcing in serifed formality that Miss Blair Henrietta Marigold was cordially requested at the Aurora Gala, the annual charity spectacle where Austin's tech tycoons measured status in $1,000 bids for art and 3-second nods from venture barons. She reread the lines 3 times, certain a spam bot had mistaken her Etsy storefront for some heiress. Yet the QR code verified. A real pass, underwritten by an anonymous sponsor. That night, long after the neighboring auto shop killed its fluorescent buzz, she unsnapped the seam gauge on her wrist and calculated the risk. The gala presented a once-in-a-lifetime shop window for her kinetic jewelry. Miniature orreries fashioned from salvaged laptop gears. But a dress worthy of that marble-pillared ballroom cost more than the lathe payments that kept Gearling's door open. Simultaneously frugal and stubborn, Blair bicycled to the West Killeen Thrift Depot at dawn, rummaged until her fingers stung from contact with metal racks, and emerged with a discounted bolt of cream gold crepe de chine, abandoned for a diagonal weave flaw that most shoppers missed. She spent 10 after-hours evenings overlocking that fabric on her grandmother's Singer, cunningly pleating each imperfection into a sunburst at the bodice and hiding a singular brass planetary charm, her signature mechanism, in the collar like a secret. She intended the night itself to unveil. On gala day, she coaxed her unruly auburn curls into a low chignon, applied lipstick that cost less than a commuter coffee, and summoned a car share whose back seat smelled of lime-flavored vape pens. The crystal Austin Hall loomed ahead, its facade of programmable LEDs scrolling sponsor logos in jewel tones. Disembarking, Blair felt the heat of camera flashes meant for others ricochet off the chrome portico and prick her exposed shoulders. Inside, a hush of velvet and violin swelled around a central atrium where dresses shimmered like liquid opal under chandeliers the size of small moons. She inhaled, adopted the steady posture she reserved for tense clients with busted heirloom watches, and joined the tide of satin. For 10 hopeful minutes she floated unnoticed, tracing her fingers over the concealed charm at her neck whenever courage threatened to leak. Then Tallulah Price happened. Tallulah, the style director of Empire Mode magazine, a woman whose Instagram following rivaled municipal populations, arrived in scarlet silk so glossy it reflected the chandelier's every filament. She and her entourage circulated like hot oil, scanning ensembles for either endorsement or prey. An aide whispered, pointing at Blair's handmade gown. Tallulah's soaring laugh sliced through concerto strains. She stalked forward, brandishing a flute of rosé, and announced to her recording live stream, "Behold the return of discount acetate." With performative grace, she settled the glass on Blair's skirt as if parking stemware on a side table, tilting just enough for fizzing pink to bleed into the fabric. The circle of spectators released a collective titter, gleeful, complicit. Blair's first instinct was to pinch the stain and blot, but the wet silk suctioned to her thigh, darkening like a bruise, and her arms froze mid-air. All childhood lessons on dignity battling the very adult wish to disappear. Her cheeks went the color of pomegranate skin, yet she forced her chin to remain level. She heard Tallulah's phone capturing every pixel of mortification and sensed algorithms already judging the sheen of her tears. In that suspended agony, Blair became acutely aware of thread counts, the weight of each bead of moisture, the micro clicks of camera shutters replacing human empathy. Gripping the tiny brass charm beneath her collar, she reminded herself that this gown, though cheap, embodied a skill no mocking stranger could possess: the ability to rebuild beauty from refuse. If humiliation was the entry tariff to the night's potential patrons, she resolved to pay it in full, silently, fiercely, while plotting how to convert disgrace into narrative leverage. Unbeknownst to her, on the far side of the atrium, a tall man had already arrested his own conversation mid-sentence, eyes fixed on the tableau of predation and resilience unfolding beneath the crystal lights. Rowan Kingsley had trained himself to study rooms the way cryptanalysts parse ciphers, searching for anomalies that hinted at deeper patterns. And on that balcony of the Crystal Austin Hall, nothing registered louder than the island of tension swirling around the girl in the cream gold dress. He excused himself from the mayor's eager monologue about quantum-secure voting kiosks, crossed the marbled mezzanine, and arrived just as the pink stain finished flowering across her skirt. For a heartbeat, all he heard was the brittle hum of spectatorship, the voyeuristic intake of breath that follows public cruelty. Then he stepped between Blair and the lenses with a swiftness that startled even himself. Peeling off the burgundy tuxedo jacket he'd worn mostly to pacify his board's PR demands, he draped it over the spreading rosé blotch, shielding the fabric and her dignity in a single unbroken motion. Tallulah Price's lips parted in protest, but Rowan's gaze, level and unapologetic, locked onto hers like a steel hatch ceiling. "Champagne glasses belong on trays, not people," he said, tone light yet edged with enough authority to reshape the crowd's reaction. The tittering collapsed into an awkward lull, and phones lowered as if following an unspoken ceasefire. Turning to Blair, he offered his hand. The moment her slender fingers touched his palm, he felt the faintest vibration. Nerves, perhaps, or the kinetic echo of the tiny brass mechanism he'd glimpsed at her collar. In the diffused glow of the chandelier, freckles surfaced across the bridge of her nose, incongruously playful against the architectural poise of her cheekbones. Up close, the gown's construction revealed itself. Meticulous French seams, bias-cut panels precisely aligned to camouflage the fabric flaw, and clever top-stitching that suggested an intimate knowledge of both tensile stress and aesthetic balance. This was not cheap. It was resourceful. The realization stirred a memory of his own adolescence, salvaging denim scraps into a makeshift blazer because scholarships did not extend to dress codes, and softened his voice. "There's a conservatory beyond those doors," he murmured, nodding toward a set of glass panels that opened onto the building's rooftop winter garden. Better air, fewer televised opinions. He guided her past a stunned Tallulah, whose entourage melted like snow in sudden sun, and shoulder-checked the sliding door release so it whispered shut behind them, muting the party's orchestral swells. The conservatory exhaled citrus and damp soil, white fairy lights twined through dwarf kumquat trees, and a trickle fountain provided the one sound neither of them needed to translate. Blair pulled the tuxedo jacket tighter around her waist, mortified to discover it smelled faintly of cedar and old book pages rather than the expected cocktail of cologne and self-importance. She started to apologize for bleeding on your gala, but Rowan stopped her with a gentle raise of his hand. "The gala can survive a reality check," he said, crouching to inspect the dress's soaked hem. "May I?" She nodded, and he lifted the edge just enough to study the weave. His thumb traced the disguised diagonal flaw with unmistakable admiration. You inverted the warp where the thread was weak and redistributed tension through box pleats, he observed. That's structural engineering, not seamstress improvisation. Blair's cheeks warmed, partly from the compliment, partly because no potential customer had ever knelt to study her craft with such reverence. She explained, voice steadier now, that cheap silk often failed at stress points, so she'd built redundancy into ornamental folds, her mechanical mind refusing to separate aesthetics from function. Rowan chuckled, straightening. Redundancy is the cornerstone of quantum error correction, he said, then introduced himself by full name and title. Recognition flickered in her eyes. Aegis Quantum was the Goliath of next-gen encryption. But instead of retreating into awe, she offered her own card. Gearling and Garnet, custom kinetic miniatures. The cardstock was thick but uncoated, edges embossed with a tiny gear motif, and Rowan turned it over twice like a puzzle box. She expected him to promise a polite follow-up and return to the marble hall. Instead, he asked about the brass charm at her collar. With shy pride, she unclasped the tiny mechanism, a working planetary gear set no larger than a dime, and let it spin between their joined hands. As each gear aligned, a sliver of garnet in the central sunwheel caught the fairy lights, sending red sparks across Rowan's cufflinks. I harvest obsolete drives, she explained, then repurpose the red arm pivots for orbital ratios. Everyone thinks art and mechanics are opposites, but gears can paint circles more perfect than any brush. Rowan's eyes narrowed with the delighted surprise of a man stumbling upon a peer in an unexpected arena. You know, he said, I've been searching for an anniversary gift for my R&D division, something that embodies elegance and precision. Would you consider licensing this orbit? Her breath hitched. Etsy orders seldom topped $100, let alone the corporate quantity implied in his casual question. I'd consider, she replied, as long as it's a partnership. Pity contracts masquerading as charity make me allergic. Rowan laughed, a low, genuine rumble that made the citrus leaves tremble. My shareholders would riot if I tried charity, he said. They insist on healthy margins. A comfortable silence followed, filled by fountain murmurs and the distant murmur of a gala that suddenly felt irrelevant. Blair brushed her fingers over the pink stain, now hidden but sticky against her thigh. Rowan noticed the gesture and asked if the silk might be salvageable. She admitted she'd packed a stain-lift pen in her clutch, just in case, and he admired the foresight. Preparedness is half of innovation, he noted, retrieving a monogrammed handkerchief from his vest pocket. He dabbed the edge of the stain as she applied the solution, their hands occasionally touching through fabric still warm from humiliation. Neither commented on the intimacy. The moment was transactional in appearance, yet each felt a subtle recalibration as if gears, newly meshed, had eliminated prior wobble. When they finally re-entered the ballroom, the party had shifted into auction mode. Tallulah lurked near the stage, her expression uncertain now that Rowan's jacket cloaked the evidence of her cruelty. Rowan guided Blair to a side aisle, but paused within earshot of the magazine director. He removed his jacket from Blair's waist, brushed it across his arm as though presenting couture, and addressed Tallulah in a voice that carried without needing to rise. Ms. Price, I believe you owe Miss Marigold for the cleaning fee, he stated, though personally I'd commission her as your next cover designer. Her workmanship is flawless. Tallulah stammered something about editorial curation, but Rowan had already steered Blair toward the silent auction exhibits, leaving murmurs of recalibrated hierarchy in their wake. At the end of the night, when valet horns echoed beneath the portico and drones captured aerial footage of departing luminaries, Rowan requested her mailing address for paperwork. But Blair suspected ulterior motives. Still, she recited the studio location. He typed it into his phone, and, noticing her bike helmet looped through a satin clutch strap, insisted on escorting her home via company car. An electric sedan, she suspected, cost more than her entire annual revenue. As the driver navigated Austin's lamplit boulevards, Rowan sat beside her in companionable quiet until they turned onto the narrow street where Geerling and Garnett's neon sign flickered between violet and teal. He studied the humble storefront with the curiosity others reserved for priceless artifacts, then offered his card, embossed with nothing but his name and a quantum circuit line drawing. "For the licensing agreement," he said, "and for any stain-resistant thread specifications you want my materials team to research." She accepted, and when the sedan pulled away, she stood beneath the buzzing sign, heartbeat ticking like a wound-up. Spring, wondering which detail of the evening would prove most improbable tomorrow. That a billionaire had shielded her with his jacket, that he saw the genius in her thrift store gown, or that, somewhere between humiliation and rescue, he had called, her craftsmanship flawless, and meant every syllable. The following morning, Blair woke to an email thread that felt like it belonged to someone else's biography. Subject lines from Aegis Quantum Legal, from Rowan's executive assistant, from an unfamiliar public relations firm offering reputation management support in light of overnight chatter. She scrolled past them, heart rattling, until she found Rowan's direct message, time-stamped 3:12 a.m. "Thought you might need breathing room before the lawyers descend. Lunch today? Your studio at 1300 hours. I'll bring proper coffee and a clean lab coat." The casual, military precision of the sign-off made her smile despite the knot in her stomach, and she spent the next 3 hours scrubbing champagne sugar from her sewing machine plates, so her workshop would smell of oil and brass, not stale rosé. At exactly 1 p.m., a slate-gray Rivian truck eased into the alley behind Geerling and Garnett, and Rowan climbed out alone, carrying a cardboard tray with 2 cappuccinos and a brown paper parcel. The suit he had worn under the gala tuxedo had been replaced by dark jeans and a heather charcoal hoodie, whose cuffs were stained with something that looked suspiciously like solder flux. She realized with a jolt that he had probably come straight from one of his fabrication labs rather than a boardroom. He took in her cluttered space, the pegboard bristling with jeweler's screwdrivers, the antique lathe rescued from a scrapyard, the half-finished kinetic brooches arranged like a miniature solar parade on her drafting table. And, rather than offering compliments, he asked questions. What spindle speed she found safest for brass that thin, how she calculated torsional stress for the micropinions, whether she had considered electroplating the gear cages with graphene to eliminate oxidative drag. By the time they finished the coffees, Blair's initial nerves had dissolved into the exhilarating sense of sparring with an intellectual equal who saw her workshop not as charming hobby, but as a prototype foundry. Rowan finally placed the unopened parcel on the table and nudged it toward her. Inside lay 3 sample wafers of a cobalt chromium alloy Aegis had been developing for extreme temperature quantum housings, sliced into sheets no thicker than cardstock. Attached, a post-it. Could make lovely planets. They were examining the alloy under her jeweler's loupe when the first notification pinged. A viral clip of last night's incident, re-edited into a meme that alternated Tallulah's scornful expression with Rowan's protective gesture. overlaid by the caption "Rich Knight, Shabby Damsel." Blair's cheeks burned. She had wanted her work, not her indignity, to go viral. Rowan watched the view count tick upward, then asked if she preferred silence or counter-narrative. When she hesitated, he opened the Notes app on his phone and drafted a single sentence. The value of a garment lies in the hands that craft it, not the label that priced it. He handed her the screen, inviting edits. She added one clause referencing sustainable salvage, pressed send, and within minutes, the quote appeared on his official feed alongside a close-up photo of her planetary charm spinning atop the cobalt wafer. The retweets multiplied so quickly the phone vibrated like a power tool, but the tone of replies shifted. Fewer laughing emojis, more questions about kinetic jewelry, about the science disguised as ornament. Rowan suggested they prototype her orbital design as the new anniversary badge for Aegis, setting a launch goal of 6 months. Tight, but feasible if she scaled production. He offered access to his microfabrication wing, with the caveat that her processes remain proprietary and her brand front-facing. Blair's head spun at the leap from Etsy batches of 20 pieces to a corporate run of thousands. Yet the challenge sparked engineer's hunger in her chest. She agreed on one condition. She would vet the working conditions at every subcontractor before delivering a single sketch. Rowan's answering grin revealed a chipped canine, an endearing flaw in an otherwise executive veneer. He counter-conditioned that she grant his materials team permission to experiment on her old lathe rather than shipping in new machinery, believing authenticity sourced from the original workspace might translate into the final product. They spent the remainder of the afternoon drafting a handshake term sheet in pencil on butcher paper, laughing when Rowan's boardroom lexicon collided with Blair's seamstress shorthand. Deliverable nebulae. She teased when he wrote stellar units instead of jewelry pieces. At dusk, he walked the narrow aisles between tool chests and scrap bins as if committing each square foot to memory. Then paused by the dress form draped in her still-damp gala gown. With gentle fingers, he turned the stained silk toward the last rays of sun slanting through the workshop window, watching the flawed weave catch light like river water over gravel. "Leave it as archive," he advised, a first draft that proved its strength. And, before she could muster a reply, he fetched a small spanner from her bench and tightened a wobbling bolt on the dress form's base, a wordless promise to steady whatever artifact her story required. When the Rivian disappeared down the alleyway minutes later, Blair stood alone amid shadows lengthening over engine parts and fabric swatches, clutching a cobalt wafer whose surface reflected, faintly, a future as luminous and improbable as any celestial orbit she had ever coaxed from discarded gears. Blair spent the next 3 weeks submerged in a tide of cobalt filings, design iterations, and municipal permit paperwork, so dense it might have been printed on lead. She slept in 90-minute increments beside the antique lathe while Rowan's materials division couriered progressively thinner alloy wafers across town for stress tests, each batch accompanied by handwritten notes like "Best tensile profile yet." Crack this open when you finally close your eyes, tucked between foam layers along, with cans of specialty cold brew. On a damp Wednesday morning, an invitation arrived in the form of a calendar attachment from Rowan's chief of staff, requesting her presence at Aegis Quantum's downtown headquarters for Phase 0 Integration Review at Oro 9:30 sharp, badge, and parking validated. Though no dress code was specified, Blair decided her first formal foray into the belly of a corporate leviathan required an outfit that balanced defiance and diplomacy. She pulled midnight blue moire salvaged from a defunct theater curtain, cut it on the bias, and spent all night tailoring a high-neck dress with hidden gussets engineered to withstand sprinting through security lanes. She lined the hem with fragments of the old champagne-stained silk, personal provenance tucked where only she would sense it, and finished by affixing a single prototype orbit brooch at her clavicle so that the tiny garnet sun spun with her pulse. When she bicycled to the monolithic tower crowned by the Aegis logo, mist clung to glass ribs, and she could see her own reflection multiplying. 100 tiny Blairs ascending toward air-locked destiny. Inside the atrium, she presented the visitor QR code Rowan had emailed at dawn, feeling absurdly underdressed among employees in sleek biometric lanyards and AI-calibrated blazers. Security escorted her to the express elevator, but at the 46th floor reception, she encountered Charlotte Drew, Vice President of Global Brand Stewardship, whose photo Blair recognized from numerous pivot table case studies on executive presence. Charlotte perched behind a marble desk whose grain resembled fossilized lightning, manicured fingers poised over a tablet that pulsed with guest profiles. Her eyes scanned Blair's dress with algorithmic precision, pausing at the orbit brooch before she offered a smile so thin it could have been laser-etched. "I'm afraid lab access is restricted to credentialed contractors," she said, voice dipped in cordial arsenic. Blair explained she was the lead designer for Rowan's anniversary commission, showing the requisition code. Charlotte's gaze flicked to the code, then back to the moire fabric, recalculating. "Our dress code for research zones excludes open-weave textiles and exposed mechanical accessories," she murmured, wielding policy like a letter opener. "Perhaps guest services can procure you appropriate attire from our boutique?" The elevator behind them chimed open, disgorging Rowan mid-stride, hoodie swapped for a charcoal blazer but still flanked by faint solder smudges. He took in Charlotte's poised blockade, Blair's tightened jaw, and the flicker of onlookers pretending to study 3D stock tickers. Without raising his voice, he asked Charlotte to recite the clause governing textile safety. She did, confident, until he interrupted after the first sentence and pointed out that the clause pertained exclusively to fraying synthetics likely to shed, particulate into clean rooms, whereas moire silk produced 0 airborne fibers under standard humidity. A fact he confirmed last night by scanning swatches on the same spectrometer that validated cryogenic gasket seals. Murmurs rippled down the corridor. Charlotte attempted a pivot. "But the brooch is artisanal metalwork, ungrounded." Rowan removed his tablet, tapped twice, and a holographic schematic of Blair's orbit appeared, annotated with dielectric constants and an electrostatic dissipative. Coating his engineers had applied at her request, making the piece safer than most employees' belt buckles. "We clear?" he asked. Charlotte inclined her head, cheeks pinking just where blush ended. He thanked her for vigilance, then added, "Let's flag this exchange for the empathy workshop next week." The corridor's oxygen seemed to thicken with collective satisfaction as Charlotte retreated behind her desk. Rowan waved Blair through security turnstiles that whisked open like applause. The R&D floor unfolded as a cathedral of steel and light. Modular stations bathed in surgical white, robotic arms assembling waveguides, engineers in color-coded lab coats gliding between tasks while a hologram of quantum entanglement spiraled overhead like a celestial mobile. Yet, as they walked, conversations paused. Heads turned toward the woman whose stitched dress argued with corporate homogeneity. Rowan introduced her not as an artisan, but as Chief Orbital Architect, a title that sent a spark across her synapses. He guided her to a mezzanine overlooking the fabrication bay, where a pair of engineers struggled with alignment on a precision mill. He encouraged Blair to advise, and soon she was elbow-deep in CAD layers, proposing micro-chamfers to mitigate burr formation. The staff, initially wary, began scribbling her suggestions on digital tablets, and within 20 minutes the mill produced a defect-free gear cage, half a micron slimmer than spec, raising cheers. Someone peeled away to hang a paper banner above her workstation. Welcome to the Gearling Singularity. Over lunch, smashed pumpkin tacos from a food bot, they convened in a glass-walled conference pod where Rowan unveiled the preliminary marketing mock-ups. The orbital brooch arrayed in a constellation pattern across a midnight backdrop. Tagline: Precision has a pulse. Blair traced the garnet sun in the render and suggested altering the tagline to Precision with a heartbeat, insisting humans, not algorithms, animate true innovation. Rowan grinned, changed the copy on the spot, then asked if she would allow a short documentary crew to film her process in the workshop. She hesitated, fearing Tallulah-style exploitation, but agreed under condition of final cut authority and equitable credit for her apprentice Lou, the high school intern who handled shipping labels. Rowan sealed the deal by messaging his media head a single directive. Subject controls narrative, non-negotiable. Later, they toured the employee lounge where a live bulletin displayed trending social commentary. The top thread featured a photo of Blair guiding the mill, captioned "Cheap Dress Girl Teaches Quantum Brothers." The replies, largely supportive, still carried troll spores. Rowan typed a brief response from the communal kiosk. Great minds share fabric and silicon. Only small ones price tags. He signed simply R.K., drawing likes faster than commentators could sneer. Blair watched the digital tide shift, realizing narrative could be steered, not merely endured. When evening floodlights tinted the skyline rose, Rowan walked her to the elevator bank, handed her a black access card embossed with a silver gear orbit, and said, "Tomorrow this becomes your floor too. Dress code. Whatever threads hold your truth." She stepped into the elevator, clutching the card like a passport, the doors sliding shut on the reflection of her midnight moiré and Rowan's approving nod. And she understood that the tower's polished corridors had not tamed her. Instead, her stitches had sewn a seam right through corporate armor, binding ingenuity to credibility with thread no boardroom scissor could sever. Daybreak painted Austin's skyline in apricot when Blair swiped the Silver Gear access card and stepped onto what the security log now labeled Orbital Division. Overnight, the mezzanine had transformed. Her lathe, from Gearling and Garnet, stood on vibration-dampening pads beside a brand-new 5-axis micromill, and, flanking both machines, was a horseshoe workbench lined with transparent drawers of tungsten burrs, jeweler's torches, conductive resins, and, carefully centered in its own velvet cradle, the Singer sewing machine Grant Marigold had bequeathed to his daughter. A placard announced heritage tool. Handle with skill. Rowan, already in safety goggles, greeted her with a breakfast burrito and an agenda rendered in ink rather than pixels, because he remembered she liked to annotate margins. Phase 0 was over. Phase 1 scaling began now, and the floor hummed with contradictory energies. Precision lasers singing in staccato, conference pods murmuring in metrics. A playlist of 1980s synth Rowan swore optimized flow state. Their first hurdle surfaced within hours. The cobalt chromium wafers, once diced into gear blanks, revealed micro-pitting at the edges, a consequence of the alloy's stubborn grain boundaries. The Odeon milling algorithm kept compensating by slowing feed rates, doubling cycle time. Untenable for large-scale production. Blair dragged a whiteboard into the aisle and, sleeves rolled, sketched stress vectors like an aerodynamicist plotting lift. She proposed an interstitial annealing step using infrared lamps repurposed from a disused wafer bake line. Rowan summoned an ops manager who swore the lamps had been auctioned months ago, only to find Rowan out-texted him by ordering replacements, delivered within 3 hours via drone freight. While they waited, Blair sewed prototype sleeves into laboratory smocks, electrically neutral linen spun with graphene filaments, so technicians could handle brooches without grounding straps. By dusk, the lamps arrived, jury-rigged into a tunnel furnace whose footprint fit between 2 robotic arms, and the next trial run produced blanks clean as lunar craters. News of the improvement spread across internal forums, and curiosity traffic to Orbital Division tripled, prompting Charlotte Drew to schedule a VIP media walkthrough. Blair balked, recalling Tallulah's glittering cruelty, but Rowan pointed out that controlling first impressions mattered. If Empire Mode's cameras recorded her commanding the division, cheaper gossip columns would lose oxygen. He secured her final cut rights in writing, then coached her through defensive poise. A stance that said confident without reading confrontational. The day of the tour, Charlotte arrived with a film crew and a list of curated talking points that used words like synergy and market-adjacent experiential luxury. Blair listened politely, then discarded the script and guided cameras to the annealing tunnel, explaining in lay terms how heat realigned cobalt lattices. She demonstrated the planetary brooch's spin by holding it to a condenser-mic'd stethoscope, so viewers could hear the whisper of frictionless bearings. When Tallulah's inevitable question about price reached her ears, Blair pivoted. The value isn't the tag, it's the torque tolerance. This brooch will survive a century's worth of applause. The line tested so well in the focus group feed that Charlotte later pitched it as the official tagline, an irony that made Rowan nearly choke on celebratory kombucha. Weeks blurred into a rhythm of prototyping days and policy-deflecting nights. Blair's apprentice, Lou, joined full-time, turning Shipping Corner into an education sphere where interns rotated through solder basics and machine vision quality checks. The Singer machine stitched microfiber pouches for finished brooches, each embroidered with the orbital schematic Rowan had first seen in her workshop. Social media hype approached supernova when Aegis released a 90-second teaser titled Precision with a Heartbeat, featuring macro shots of gears meshing, while Blair's voiceover spoke about the poetry of salvage. Comments ranged from heartfelt to envious, but troll frequency dropped as authenticity outweighed cynicism. One evening, as they locked the lab, Rowan admitted the campaign's reach astonished even him. Keynote invitations poured in, and pre-orders exceeded forecast. He confessed he was drafting a new corporate value tenet, handmade intelligence, inspired by her blended disciplines. Trouble flared from an unexpected coordinate. A viral alt-fashion blogger accused Blair of selling out to defense capitalism, citing Aegis's military contracts. The post spun into a thread about weaponized tech laundering its image through artisan partnerships. Although trolls had dwindled, these critics were articulate, and Blair felt their arguments prick deep. At an emergency late-night coffee summit, she asked Rowan point-blank how he reconciled missile guidance algorithms with kinetic jewelry celebrating human joy. Rowan didn't dodge. He spoke of compliance frameworks, of ethical supply chains, but ended by admitting his industry-walked edges. Most tools can wound or mend. Intention is aftermarket. He offered her an exit clause, no penalties, contracts voidable if her conscience rebelled. Blair spent a sleepless night pacing between spinning gears and pinned silk samples, but at dawn she resumed drafting assembly jigs. She would rather influence the tenor of a giant than shout from its shadow. Phase 1 concluded with the first full production batch destined for employee beta testers. At a launch huddle, Rowan presented Blair a slim case lined with recycled mahogany. Inside lay an orbital brooch engraved Ziwoma-1, its garnet replaced by a lab-grown ruby matching the hue of champagne that once stained her dress. He fastened it to her smock, hand lingering half a heartbeat longer than protocol. Cameras clicked, confetti cannons, Lou's idea, popped biodegradable mylar across the mezzanine, and for one shimmering moment, Blair saw her reflection in every gear surface. A girl whose cheap silk had been alchemized by stubborn skill into a signal, flaring through the glass corridors of power. Late that night, after the last robot arm powered down and the mezzanine lights dimmed to astronaut blue, Rowan walked her to the freight elevator. He gestured toward the city's glittering grid and said, "I used to think quantum states were the purest superpositions. Then I met a world where address can be both tragedy and triumph." Blair, exhausted but incandescent, replied that superposition collapses once observed. What mattered was who observed first, and chose celebration over scorn. The elevator doors parted, swallowing mechanical hum, and she descended with prototype Zorro-01 pulsing at her collar, ready to salvage more than metal from the detritus of expectation. Blair barely had time to savor the triumphant hum still reverberating through orbital division before the next wave of turbulence arrived in the guise of ivory-embossed subpoenas. Vanguard Asset Management, a minority bloc on the Aegis Board, petitioned for an emergency vote to suspend Rowan's discretionary spending, citing unaudited artisanal ventures with no clear defense synergy. The move, orchestrated by Marius Falk, an old guard investor who regarded innovation as a line item to be shaved rather than a wellspring to be fed, threatened not only the fledgling Brooch program, but also Rowan's latitude to fund Blair's community apprenticeship pipeline. Rowan summoned his legal counsel to a midnight war room, yet even he could not ignore that 2 percentage points of voting stock might unseat his authority if proxies aligned. Blair watched the boardroom live stream from her studio. The sight of gray-suit silhouettes debating the worth of her life's work without context resurrected memories of Tallulah's champagne sneer. Rather than pace in helpless frustration, she called Lou, and every orbital tech rotated through the project, marshaled them like a strike team, and by dawn they had drafted a 40-page impact brief detailing how the kinetic brooch project had already reduced waste alloy by 18%, inspired 3 patent filings for low-drag microbearings, and generated a waitlist revenue projection surpassing the cost of 1 mid-range drone program. Rowan slipped the brief into his presentation deck minutes before the emergency session. When Falk challenged the numbers, Lou, beaming in from the mezzanine, walked the board through each metric, streaming live data from the factory sensors onto the conference screens. Several directors shifted in their seats as the mechanical poetry they'd dismissed crystallized into undeniable quarterly upside. Still, Falk played a last card. A leaked tabloid headline resurrecting the cheap dress girl angle now spun as evidence that Rowan made multi-million-dollar decisions based on sentimental infatuation. Blair's pulse roared as the article flashed on screen, complete with paparazzi photo of Rowan wiping champagne from her skirt. Before Rowan could respond, she unmuted herself and addressed the board directly, voice trembling, resolve steel. She explained how her father's textile patents had been swallowed by predatory investors who mocked his thrift just as Empire Mode had mocked hers, and how salvaging scraps into strength was not charity, but lineage. Then she lifted prototype 001 to the camera, rotated its orbit until the ruby glinted, and recited torque tolerances, mean time to failure stats, and the forecast that each brooch sold would underwrite scholarships in materials science for underserved schools, an ROI measured in both dollars and minds. The silence that followed felt like an acoustic vacuum. Even Falk's lips compressed as if tasting an unfamiliar flavor. Respect. Voting commenced, and Rowan retained his discretionary authority by a margin larger than pre-meeting tallies predicted, owing in no small part to two swing directors swayed by Blair's data-driven passion. Exiting the virtual dais, Rowan texted Blair a single line. Dinner, no spreadsheets, rooftop at 8. She replied with a thumbs-up emoji flanked by two tiny gear icons, then spent the afternoon ripping seams from the last remnant of her champagne-stained silk. When Rowan arrived on the Gearling rooftop, a patchwork of tar paper, skylights, and potted succulents, twilight spilled apricot light across the city grid. Blair greeted him in a new garment. A knee-length wrap jacket stitched from the salvaged silk interwoven with cobalt chromium thread. The stain transformed into a deliberately dyed ombre flourish over the heart. The orbit brooch sat proud at the lapel, spinning faster than ambient air currents should allow. She'd embedded a micromotor to keep it alive as long as the wearer's body heat stayed above 90 degrees. Rowan, still exhilarated by the board victory, produced 2 enamel mugs of hot cider, and, after a hesitant breath, a small velvet box. Inside lay a ring fabricated from the same alloy as the brooch gears, its outer band etched with a waveform of Blair's recorded laugh. The moment during the gala when she realized his jacket smelled of cedar. He did not kneel. Instead, he placed the box between them on the picnic table, scarred with solder burns. "I've spent years quantizing trust into secure channels," he said, eyes reflecting skyline neon. "But every protocol circles back to one axiom. A system is only as strong as its fidelity. I want to build fidelity with you, in filings, in stitches, in whatever chaos waits." Shock warmed her from collarbone to fingertips. She reminded him they'd barely survived the first corporate ambush, that tabloids were sharpening blades for round. 2. He countered that uncertainty was the baseline of quantum existence, and partnerships succeeded when they embraced superposition rather than forcing collapse. She opened the box, traced the waveform engraving, and asked, half teasing, whether accepting made her complicit in defense capitalism. He grinned. "No, it makes defense capitalism complicit in handmade intelligence." As the moon climbed, she slid the ring onto her grease-stained finger and felt the cool alloy adjust to body heat, same as the gears it would one day protect from corrosion. Cameras and press statements could wait. For now, the only witness was Austin's warm wind tugging at rooftop tarps, and the faint whir of the ruby sun orbit marking time. The next morning, they would finalize production scaling, draft an employee profit-sharing clause Blair insisted upon, and schedule a media briefing where Tallulah Price, now hedging contrition, would moderate. But on this roof chapter, deadlines fluttered into insignificance, eclipsed by two innovators leaning over a picnic table littered with alloy shavings and silk thread, sealing an alliance neither cheap ridicule nor billion-dollar crossfire had managed to unravel. The official unveiling of the orbital anniversary brooch unfolded 4 months later in the cavernous turbine hall that Aegis Quantum normally reserved for cryogenic chamber stress tests. Overnight, the engineering bay had been converted into a kind of kinetic planetarium. Hundreds of ceiling-mounted servos swung polished mirrors in slow arcs, throwing concentric rings of light that pulsed in synchrony with the heartbeat telemetry, embedded in every badge. Blair, dressed in a graphite-black jumpsuit whose seams followed the same orbital geometry as the brooch, supervised final calibration, while Rowan paced between technicians, double-checking that each optical sensor reported latency below 6 microseconds. The guest list included Fortune 100 executives, materials science dignitaries, and, at Blair's insistence, 30 high school students from Title I districts who had never stepped inside a research facility. The program began with an ambient hush rather than a flourish. House lights dimmed, and footage filled the 20-meter screen. Macro shots of brass swarf spiraling off Blair's antique lathe. Infrared imagery of the annealing tunnel's cobalt lattice realigning grain by grain. Time-lapse of interns soldering, micro motors in rows like mechanical seedlings. When the video cut to a close-up of the champagne-stained dress, gasps rippled across the audience. The stain dissolved backward through cinematographic magic, revealing the original fabric, then rematerialized as ombre silk on Blair's new jacket, a visual thesis that humiliation could be metabolized into design. On cue, the turbine hall's mirrors converged into a single focused cone, illuminating Blair and Rowan standing side by side on the catwalk above the production line. Blair spoke first, her voice amplified but unhurried, thanking the machinists by name and the students for lending their curiosity to the project. She explained torque tolerance in metaphors of dance steps, described dielectric nanocoatings as invisible umbrellas, and disclosed that every unit sold would funnel 30% of profit directly into a scholarship fund overseen by a board, split evenly between Aegis engineers and community educators. When she invited the first scholarship cohort onto the stage, the students filed in wearing lab coats whose sleeves were embroidered with their own stitched initials alongside a tiny orbit emblem. Cameras flashed. Several stock analysts visibly recalculated valuation models on their tablets. Rowan stepped forward next, abandoning the teleprompter for a pocket notebook scrawled with equations and personal asides. He spoke about entropy, not as a threat to systems, but as a promise that every structure could be reordered if energy was applied thoughtfully. Gesturing to Blair, he recalled the gala night and confessed he had never expected a defensive maneuver to become the blueprint for Aegis's new innovation doctrine. Then, in a move his PR team had neither scripted nor cleared, he closed the notebook and said, "Allow me to correct one persistent headline. Blair Marigold is not cheap dress girl. She is co-architect of our most elegant project and, as of this morning, my fiancé and equal partner in every venture that follows." The hall erupted, some in applause, a few in startled laughter. But the decisive sound was the synchronized whir of hundreds of brooches activating as biometric sensors registered. the collective spike in heart rate. Rings of light cascaded across the ceiling like ripples from a meteor hitting calm water. Tallulah Price, stationed at the media riser, saw her exclusive angle evaporate into universal coverage. Yet, when Blair later approached her with a prototype brooch and a calm request that Empire Mode document the apprenticeship program rather than runway gossip, Tallulah hesitated only a moment before agreeing. Clicks came easier when redemption arcs were real. Meanwhile, in the VIP gallery, Marius Falk conferred quietly with his analysts, conceding that the pre-orders and ESG buzz had doubled share forecasts. He sent Rowan a curt text, "Well played," and unsubscribed from the Spend Freeze agenda. After the ceremony, the crowd dispersed to interactive stations where engineers dissected brooch components under microscopes for curious guests. Blair noticed one scholarship student, Aaliyah, a quiet girl from East Austin, lingering near the Singer sewing machine displayed in a plexiglass case. Blair unlocked the cover, invited her to touch the flywheel, and whispered that the machine had once lived in a trailer with no running water, and that every new idea began with turning this very crank. Aaliyah traced the worn oak base with reverence and asked if discarded ideas mattered. Blair answered they were like gears that didn't fit the current assembly but might power a future one. The trick was to keep them oiled with patience. Night deepened. Guests thinned, but the mirrors overhead still revolved, now set to a slower, almost lullaby tempo. Blair and Rowan found a moment on the observation deck where the city lights mirrored their orbital display. She removed prototype Urso 1, replaced it with a production piece marked $10,000 to honor the first full batch, and pinned Urso 1 to Rowan's lapel in exchange. They laughed at the symbolism, circles trading orbits, then fell quiet, absorbing the improbable path from thrift store silk to institutional shift. Down on the floor, the students loaded into buses, each carrying a lab coat and a sealed envelope containing the first scholarship installment. One paused to wave, the orbit on her chest spinning in erratic excitement. Blair squeezed Rowan's hand, feeling the rotational tremor echo in her own pulse, and recognized the sensation not as culmination but ignition, a kinetic promise that would keep catching light long after gala gossip faded, its torque anchored by twin signatures stitched into every hidden seam. Winter arrived with a hush thick enough to muffle Austin's habitual clamor, and in the lull that follows any great launch, Blair and Rowan discovered what it meant to inhabit orbit rather than chase it. The orbital anniversary brooch had eclipsed every forecast. Installations on 4 continents, museum acquisitions already petitioned, yet success generated its own entropy, a drift of smaller crises and paperwork constellations that could drag lovers into separate gravitational wells. To resist, they borrowed a practice from Blair's watch repair days, scheduled disassembly. Every Friday after dusk, they powered down the mezzanine, locked their phones in a Faraday box, and disappeared into Geerling and Garnett's back room, armed with nothing but sketch pads, needle-nosed pliers, and a thermos of tomato bisque. There, amid the talcum smell of jeweler's rouge, they stripped one ordinary object: a hotel alarm clock, a retired drone motor, once even Tallulah's donated high-heel buckle, into elemental pieces, studying how form married function, debating what redesign might honor both. They called it the unmaking, a ritual that reminded them any engine, corporate or mechanical, could be reimagined if its keepers stayed curious. One such Friday, during a storm that drummed corrugated roofing like timpani, Rowan laid a slim mahogany box on the workbench. Inside rested 2 rings machined from leftover cobalt chromium bar, their outer edges micro-etched with twin gear trains that meshed when the rings were pressed crown to crown. In the groove of Blair's band, a filament of champagne-stained silk had been resin-sealed, its weave immortalized. He spoke no proposal. Words were old news, but he offered the box like he'd present a prototype for destructive testing, inviting scrutiny. Blair plucked 1 ring, rolled it across the scarred wooden surface, watched it travel a perfect line despite the bench's uneven grain, and pronounced it tolerance below 10 microns. Pass. She picked up Rowan's caliper, clicked it shut over her own racing pulse, and nodded. They signed the county courthouse form online, the witness line they left for Lou, who burst into tears that short-circuited her eyeliner circuit, then hugged them both with the fearless pride of someone certain she'd apprenticed beneath legends. Marriage, once public rumor, became private hardware. Tandem bike commutes to the tower. Arguments about thermostat settings resolved with data logging sensors. A kitchen drawer divided equally between spatulas and precision tweezers. But even stable systems crave periodic shock, and that arrived in an email from the Smithsonian's Cooper Hewitt, an invitation for Blair to keynote an exhibit on adaptive craft, with a caveat. They wanted the original stained silk dress as centerpiece. She balked. The dress felt like scar tissue. Rowan suggested a compromise. Restore it, but retain the discoloration under UV transparent resin, a visible echo of origin. Restoration required hours, bleached in chemical baths, each wash yielding ghostly wisps of dye that swirled like auroras. During one late session, Blair realized the fabric would never be museum robust. Its fibers, like memories, were strongest when interlaced with new narrative. She clipped multi-metered strands, wove them into weft with cobalt microfilaments, and embedded a hair-thin LED that pulsed when ambient sound exceeded the decibel level of Tallulah's mocked laughter. An interactive reminder that ridicule could be harvested for illumination. The museum accepted the hybrid piece, labeling it Stitch 404. Error corrected. Opening night in New York, Blair wore a jumpsuit stitched from recycled lab coats, the copper thread of her orbital seams glinting under gallery track lights. Critics expecting couture gasped instead at utility. Press studs, cargo pockets, a detachable hood, then scribbled feverishly about post-luxury semiotics. Rowan, tuxedo-swapped for a minimalist black Nehru jacket, circulated like dark matter, imperceptible yet shaping conversations. Each time curators referenced the billionaire who legitimized salvage, he redirected credit to Lou, to machinists, to scholarship students now patent co-authors. In a quiet alcove, he found Blair alone before her dress relic, the LED heartbeat glowing faint every time a tourist snickered at selfies. He rested his chin on her shoulder and suggested they leave before speeches, board a midnight train to D.C., and spend Saturday mapping the National Mall in steps that mirrored planetary orbits. She counter-offered a detour to the defunct Bethlehem, steel stacks so they could scavenge oxidized plates for the next series of kinetic corsages. They compromised by buying 2 coach tickets with no destination yet assigned, falling asleep against rattling windows while the East Coast blurred into indecipherable waveform. Months spiraled. The Brooch Line funded 37 scholarships. 2 recipients hacked the micromotors into haptic compasses for the visually impaired, a pivot Blair celebrated louder than any quarterly dividend. Empire Mode ran a redemption cover titled Seams of Power, with Tallulah's editor's letter confessing that fashion's future lay in humility, engineered to outlast spectacle. Vanguard's Marius Falk, now a grudging convert, invested in Marigold Labs' expansion, a downtown foundry where apprentices welded old bicycle chains into exoskeletal art for amputee dancers. At the inauguration, Blair gave Falk a limited edition brooch engraved with the words, "Profits are proofs, but people are purpose." He didn't quite smile, but the torque sensor registered a BPM spike sufficient to ignite the garnet sun. On their first anniversary, Rowan lured Blair to the Aegis roof under pretense of watching a meteor shower. Instead, he unveiled a single-gear observatory dome powered by her micro-bearings. Turning a brass handwheel parted the petals like a nocturnal flower, revealing a telescope trained not on any star, but on the vacant patch of sky where last year's gala drones had hovered, capturing her humiliation. "Point of origin," he whispered. Blair leaned into the eyepiece, saw only black velvet dotted with possibility, and understood that coordinates mattered less than vectors. They stayed until cold dew filmed the dome. As sunrise pinked the horizon, her brooch caught first light, the ruby sunwheel yawning into spin, scattering photons like confetti across aluminum struts. She turned to Rowan and said the line she'd rehearsed silently for weeks. "Let's design a future where waste is only a temporary state." He grinned, motioned to the handwheel, and together they sealed the dome, gears meshing so precisely they sang, a duet of engineering and resolve audible only to those near enough to listen and brave enough to repurpose every fracture into flight.